For more on the impact of the conflict, we're joined now by Michael Barnett. He's a professor of international affairs and political science at the George Washington University here in D.C. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, Professor, we know that the death toll continues to rise. I'd like to get your reaction on this latest news of Israel forming a unity government. What does that mean? What will that do?
Well, the unity governments that have been formed in the past have done, the most important thing is to communicate to the Israeli public that politics now ceases. And in fact, this is a national unity government, which means that it represents all Israelis and their interests, so that partisan politics gets put aside in favor of what is a collective national crisis. The other important dimension, especially now, is that Israel's cabinet is comprised of a lot of right-wing ideologues and zealots, and with very little military experience. And as a consequence, there's very little trust in this particular Israeli cabinet in terms of its ability to, in fact, focus on the right things. And the idea then of having an emergency cabinet comprised of both those who are in the opposition, but also some military elites, is a way of demonstrating to the Israelis that the serious adults are in the room, the people with knowledge and experience have their hands on the wheel, and therefore they can have confidence in the decisions that are being taken at this moment.
We know that the United Nations is confirming that some of its aid workers were killed in Gaza. Some of their buildings were hit, and they've also requested a humanitarian corridor. How difficult would that be given the situation on the ground, and what kind of support could they get?
Well, I think the humanitarian corridor is actually a really good idea. It's similar to the kinds of things that that the UN has used that go under the name of safe havens. There are a couple of issues as we think about a corridor, and as my understanding, the corridor here is not about trying to get basic humanitarian supplies into Gaza, but rather to provide Gazans, civilians, as a way to, in fact, remove themselves from the violence and the war. And to that extent, I think this is actually something that probably should be done. Whether it gets done and how it gets done depends first on the host countries, in this case, Israel and possibly Egypt. There's going to be the need to try and make sure that no rebels, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, try to smuggle their way along with the civilians. And there's going to have to be then a need for some kind of UN, maybe UNHCR role in helping to manage these camps on a temporary basis. I think the real challenge here is, will Hamas let the innocents go? Because Hamas typically uses Gazan civilians as a human shield, and has thrived on their suffering as a way of bolstering hopefully sympathy for the Palestinian cause. So, part of it is there a place for Palestinian citizens to go? And then secondly, will Hamas let them leave?
As we speak, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is on his way to Israel. We know that Britain's foreign secretary is already there. The Arab League just met. Talk to us about the international and regional intervention and what could happen in the coming days and weeks ahead.
Well, I'll stick to the moment and then speculate about the future. At the moment, what you see are a variety of forces that are lining up in slightly different ways. Those that are coming from the U.S., the U.K., Germany, other European capitals are declaring their firm sympathy for Israel and support for any kind of actions it needs to take in self-defense. There are some calls for restraint, with the worry that Israel will go too far at this very raw moment. But by and large, it's to demonstrate their support for Israel. On the other hand, you have those whose primary interests are for the Palestinians and for the Palestinian civilians who are about to and are already experiencing their humanitarian crisis. And the question is, what can be done to protect them? And which is, I think, really, it's an important subject of discussion right now. We haven't heard, although we've heard a little bit, of the need for recognition of international humanitarian law, and I think every call for that is necessary. Where things play out after this is going to depend on, what happens in this next chapter in the military sphere, and whether Israel goes in for a partial assault or a full-scale ground war in Gaza. My hope, although there's very little conversation about this, is how whatever comes about with this military chapter might lead to some conversations about where the politics goes in the future. The problem with previous wars between Israel and Gaza is that it's always gone back to the status quo ante, just simply reproducing the kinds of problems and tragedies that we're seeing play out now. So can Israel and the Palestinians somehow work their way out of this current situation so it doesn't simply keep bringing more misery and suffering?
Professor Michael Barnett, thank you for joining us.